Justice Studies at Eastern Kentucky University. Grounded in the interdisciplinary field of critical prison studies, his work examines history, political economy, and the cultural logics of the carceral state. He's the author of Cold Cage's Crisis, The Rise of the Prison Economy in Central Appalachia, as well as Progressive Punishment, Job Loss, Jail Growth, and the Neoliberal Logic of Carceral Expansion. And he's the co-editor of the recently published book, The Jail is Everywhere, Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration. So yeah, thank you for joining us today, and there we go.
Awesome. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Brad. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm really excited to be with you all. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Excited to chat. Um, my plan was to talk for maybe 30 minutes or so to ensure that we've got like plenty of time to just discuss, answer questions, like whatever. And on that note, obviously happy to answer questions on anything that I offer today. But if you have other questions, I know at least some, maybe most or all of you are grad students. And so if people have questions just about like, I don't know, like research process or grad student, more grad student oriented questions, like happy to talk through any and all of that kind of stuff too. So I'm going to jump right in. And what I thought about doing today was trying to offer, I suppose it's maybe a set of two or three larger arguments. But I wanted to start by grounding my comments today in the urgency of the moment, or one of the urgent moments that are facing us and that are particularly acute right here in Kentucky. So the Bureau of Prisons, which is the federal agency under the Department of Justice that operates the federal prison system, just posted, let's see, 2 weeks ago, late October, its record of decision, the ROD, which is like the formal declaration that concluded that agency's, the Bureau of Prisons movement, through the environmental review process that's required under NEPA, the federal environmental law. That record of decision, again, ROD is the acronym, conveyed the Bureau of Prisons' intent to build a prison called FCI Letcher, Federal Correctional Institution Letcher, which is a prison that they have proposed, again for a second time, to reside on a mountaintop removal site in Letcher County in eastern Kentucky. If you've read some or part or all of Cold Cage's Crisis, you'll know this is not the first time that the Bureau of Prisons has tried to build a prison here in Letcher County. The origins for this particular prison began almost 20 years ago in 2005, when the congressman who represents all of Eastern Kentucky, his name is Hal Rogers, first floated the idea for a prison in Letcher County to local political leaders. That initial push in 2005 resulted in this like prolonged attempt between 2015 and 2019 to build what at that time was called USP Letcher. Okay. A coalition of sorts came together in those years. Again, this is roughly between 2015 and 2019. And that coalition defeated that prison through a number of strategic interventions, organizing on the ground, environmental challenges, and eventually a lawsuit. And so that prison was defeated. It was like a historic defeat in 2019. 3 years later, after that victory, in September of 2022, the Bureau of Prisons announced plans to build what they were now calling FCI Letcher. This announcement came 2 months to the day after horrific floods ripped through eastern Kentucky in late July of 2022, which caused, devastation and death across 6 counties. And Letcher County was, in fact, in the heart of the flood zone. And so now, in this moment, there is this significant struggle over the construction of FCI Letcher with the Bureau of Prisons, Congressman Rogers, and local political leaders pushing for the prison, while a new iteration of that coalition, comprised of local organizers, state policy and environmental organizations, national level organizations, and people who were formerly incarcerated in that region, are all pushing together to defeat that prison once again and once and for all. So I will come back to this particular struggle kind of throughout my comments this morning. Uh, and of course, like happy to talk about all of it or whatever questions come up during our discussion. But I wanted to start with it, and I wanted to start with it because it is this sort of moment of urgency. But what I want to do is really actually sort of situate it, um, and the carceral expansion of which it is a part more generally in these sorts of arguments that I think will try to help us sort of make sense of what's happening um, in this moment of carceral expansion across scales towards trying to sort of sharpen our own analysis and political intervention. So I'm going to pull from a few different things. I'm going to pull a little bit from the book, from Cold Cage's Crisis. I'm pulling from this new book that Shane mentioned called The Jail is Everywhere, which is a volume that's organized around 11 chapters, all written by anti-jail organizers around the country. And I'm pulling a little bit from some new work in one county in Eastern Kentucky that I'm doing around a very overcrowded jail. So the first sort of larger point, I suppose, that I wanted to make this morning is the importance of thinking about this concept that I talk about in the book called carceral social reproduction, and to kind of spend a little bit of time with you all kind of building out what I mean by that. So just to be clear, if this prison were to be built in Letcher County, if FCI were to be built, it would join 16 other prisons in Central Appalachia. 8 of those are in Eastern Kentucky. Most of those 16 have been built over the last 4 decades or so. That expansion has occurred at every scale of the state, from new and now overcrowded local county jails, right, to new or reopened or expanded state prisons to new federal prisons, right? And in fact, the region of Central Appalachia, unless I'm mistaken, is the densest concentration of federal prisons in the United States, right? So Hal Rogers, this politician I mentioned briefly before, who represents all of Eastern Kentucky, has brought 3 federal prisons already to his district, which opened in Clay, Martin, and McCreary counties in 1992, 2003, and 2004. All, of course, kind of marketed to those counties as a kind of rural jobs program. Today, decades after their construction, those counties remain 3 of the poorest counties in one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. And so, of course, despite this, the Bureau of Prisons and Hal Rogers and Letcher County officials are still fighting for the construction of FCI Letcher. What I want to be sure to sort of underline here is that in other counties in Eastern Kentucky, it's actually the state of Kentucky, as opposed to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, that has built out state prisons or added on capacity to existing state prisons, reopened a decommissioned private prison, built out county jail expansion, et cetera. So this really sort of expansive, multi-scalar carceral geography has occurred, and it's occurred, my argument, I suppose, would be that it's occurred as a response to 2 distinct but interwoven and, in fact, sort of mutually constitutive crises. First, and probably most sort of self-evident, is the crisis of mass incarceration, which is actually accelerating in Kentucky. The state passed sentencing reform in 2011, but the state's incarcerated population has actually grown since then. There's this analysis done by this really fantastic state level policy organization just last year that looked at all of the bills passed by the state legislature since then, since sentencing reform, and found that 70, I think the numbers were 77 bills had been passed since 2011 that had further extended criminalization or enhanced criminal penalties, about 77 bills, right, compared to 14 that had reduced them. So like a 5-to-1 ratio of further sort of punitive criminalizing legislation. Most recently, just this year, or earlier this year, the House passed, or the legislature passed House Bill 5, which was like an omnibus crime bill, which extended 3 strikes legislation, or reinstated 3 strikes. It expanded the violent offender statute. It criminalizes being without a home. So in a moment where some states are at least paying some rhetorical attention to mass incarceration, maybe beginning to kind of reevaluate the human and financial costs of it, Kentucky is really sort of doubling down on the practice. So that's one crisis, right? But the second one that I think is just as, if not more, germane for trying to think through what's happening here is, of course, the collapse of the coal industry. And with it, the loss of once somewhat reliable, if sort of always exploitative opportunities for work and revenue and social reproduction, right? Which is just a way of talking about all of the um, all of the processes that we all engage in to reproduce ourselves under capitalism that occur outside of the workplace. Scholars of social reproduction have kind of traditionally looked at the scale of the home, which is really compelling and important. And um, I'm also thinking about it at the scale of like the community, the county, the region. And I just want to dig in here a little bit. So the prisons and the jails are really quite directly an attempt to, like explicitly so, to manage or resolve these dual crises. I think as some of you, maybe all of you know, like in what to me is the most kind of visceral spatial expression of that, the prisons are often built on top of surplus land, land that's been abandoned by coal companies, right? So next to old coal mines or on top of mountaintop removal sites. But it goes beyond that and goes a lot deeper too. So as the coal industry began to sort of depart the region, coal companies like offloaded what scholars call like the burden of social reproduction onto communities and onto households, even as those companies had also been actively devastating opportunities for social reproduction by their very practice of mining coal, right? By contaminating water tables and polluting streams and air and enclosing common areas for like hunting and foraging and harvesting, and of course, like shifting production and cutting jobs. So today, coal employment in Kentucky is at its lowest since the 1890s. There's something like 4,000 coal jobs left in the state. And I think in a sort of stark contrast, there's about double that number of correctional officer jobs. It's something like 8,000. Um, but at the same time that displacement has happened, we also have to recognize that jobs in the carceral economy don't actually necessarily go to local residents and certainly don't come close to approximating the high number of coal jobs that there were in the state at the height of the mining industry. So that contradiction, I think, raises some important questions for us. Like, if the jobs don't actually materialize, what is the work that the prisons are sort of performing in the region? And this is again where sort of social reproduction theory, I think, is particularly helpful. The prisons and the jails have been really crucial for addressing, in particular, sort of the loss of revenue that happened when coal departed. So communities essentially plan for new cages, and in turn, existing cages structure how communities plan. So jails are increasingly reliant on per diem payments for incarcerating state prisoners and federal ICE detainees in order to sort of keep their own lights on. So just to be concrete about it, there's something like 25,000 state prisoners in the state of Kentucky, but about half of them are locked up in county jails. And this is for this very kind of vulgar financial calculus by the state. It costs the state of Kentucky a lot less money to lock someone up in a county jail than in a state prison. And for county jails in struggling rural counties, those per diem payments either directly help them run their jail and like keep their doors open, or go into that county's like general fund. Those per diem payments do. Um, and then so that's the jails, right? And then the prisons also are utilized often to address what we might think of as like the crisis, the crises manifestation in terms of like social infrastructure, something like that. So like all over the historical record for a bunch of the prisons that have been built, is evidence of communities like grafting their hopes for survival onto, that is, for their own reproduction, right? Onto the prospect of a prison coming. So to keep community centers open or to keep rural hospitals in their county, to justify expanding or paving roads or updating wastewater treatment infrastructure, or to maintain or boost school enrollments. So to put that another way, right, if we're interested in really understanding this or intervening in it, I think we have to understand the flourishing carceral geography of places like Eastern Kentucky. Of course, in the context of mass incarceration and criminalization, but beyond them too, and even maybe even beyond the changing nature of rural employment. And I think thinking about social reproduction pushes us to see spaces for analysis and intervention in what might seem like, sort of like mundane geographies of municipal budgets or regional development, because the carceral state sort of mobilizes or even metabolizes that terrain into constitutive components of its own reproduction, right? So, if we ask sort of the central question of social reproduction theory, which is like, how does the worker arrive at the prison for work? There's very like concrete ways to answer that I think are very revealing. They arrive on, I say this in the book, they arrive on roads, obviously, right? Some of which are only able to be paved or updated because of the prison. Um, but also just probing a little bit further, their arrival at the prison gates for work is sort of contingent on them being uh, credentialed, qualified, ideologically positioned, healthy for that work, which raises, you know, the centrality of social reproduction in the home or in the school or in the doctor's office or in the university, right? And I think, you probably, if you read the chapter on social reproduction in the book, I go into some detail there, and I think in another chapter about the ways that folks sort of imagine this and mapped it in their counties, particularly at the level of like school superintendents and school boards and even students. And testimonies like those are they're like really fraught and challenging to think with, but they're also, I think, really instructive because it also then I think raises this important question to us, which is like, okay, so what are the conditions of possibility for the worker to arrive at the prison? But then also in turn, what does the prison produce in the worker and in their community? And here I think that question, I think, forces us to sort of grapple with the fact that an economy organized around a prison is different than one organized around a factory or mining, even. And I want to offer here two treatments of that question that are somewhat in tension. One of which you might be familiar with because it's in the book, and one of which is somewhat new because the data has changed a little bit. So the first way to answer that, or the first way to sort of treatment of it, is that renovating community and regional identities and economies around a prison, I think pretends in a place like Eastern Kentucky, pretends a thoroughly racialized and gendered social order where largely white and largely male Appalachian residents experiencing precarity are being kind of deputized into what Nicole Siegel calls violence work to then administer the captivity of other people experiencing precarity disproportionately from communities of color. One way to think about this is as like kind of internal and external pacification, right? With the prison providing new cages for the multiracial working class, and then a kind of purported economic and psychic salve for rural communities in acute crisis. But, or not but, and applying the politics of scale to this question offers a somewhat different reading. And my argument here is just that I think we have to hold these two things that seem somewhat contradictory at the same time. So recent trends in criminalization and imprisonment at the state and local level in Kentucky suggest that this is a more complex, racialized, and gendered terrain than the one that I just offered. So Kentucky right now has this, unless I'm mistaken, or unless the data has changed in the last few months, I think Kentucky has the second highest rate of incarceration for women in the United States. And at the same time, certainly over the last 5 years, incarceration rates in cities in Kentucky have been declining. And what's been growing are rural incarceration rates, both for jails and prisons. Now, rural is by no means code for white, right? We have to acknowledge that. And at the same time, it is also true that in some places in Kentucky and in Eastern Kentucky in particular, very overcrowded jails are filled with huge numbers of largely, if not mostly, white people. So once the foot soldiers of empire in the region, white Appalachians have been subjected to the violence of capital and the state since the arrival of wage labor, from mine wars to Bloody Harlan to black lung disease. And so in eastern Kentucky, there is now a growing concentration of people subjected to criminalization and incarceration, as well as the facilities that incarcerate them and promise to employ them. And so those facilities are simultaneously sort of promising a future for some by also potentially foreclosing it for others, right? So I think we just have to sort of sit with that tension. So that's sort of part one of what I wanted to be sure to say today. I know I probably should stop talking in about 10 minutes or so. So I'm gonna there's two other sort of points that I want to be sure to make. The second one is about carceral humanism. And what I'm going to say here is a little bit speculative because I'm trying to sort of think through how to think about this in the Eastern Kentucky context. So, carceral humanism is a concept coined by James Kilgore that a number of us have been writing about for a while. And it's basically like the catch-all term for trying to describe jail and prison and even police expansion through their purported abilities to extend everything from treatment to therapeutic justice to rehabilitation to even, in their most sort of like extreme version, social and racial justice to their captives, right? I first encountered this a while ago in the mid 2000s. I was a graduate student at Indiana University, and Bloomington, where I was living, was proposing something that they called a justice campus. It was a massive carceral expansion project that would have exponentially expanded that county's ability to incarcerate its residents. But it was being proposed by the local liberal and progressive establishment, who would simultaneously offer these pretty well-informed criticisms of mass incarceration and then, like, literally in the next sentence, turn around and endorse this like massive expansion project through invoking its imagined ability to extend county benevolence to its most sort of marginalized residents. At that time, in 2008 or so, it felt like this sort of new emerging logic of incarceration. But now, especially on the heels of having edited this book on jail expansion around the country, it feels like more of a central tendency animating jail expansion. I'd be curious, if in Blacksburg there was a project for or proposal for jail expansion, my prediction, I would suppose, in this moment would be that local leaders would feel like to justify jail expansion, they couldn't rely on sort of the old school logic of, kind of very transparently racist fears and kind of law and order politics, but that they would have to say, well, we need to take care of our most marginalized people, we need to provide drug treatment, et cetera. That's kind of carceral humanism. There's a couple of ways for trying to sort of think through why it's happening to the extent that it's happening now. In the most sort of charitable, in my opinion, sort of charitable interpretation of why it's happening, I think in the context of decades of austerity budgets that have drained public dollars away from, housing and healthcare and all the things we know that we need, we might understand carceral humanism as the solution of sort of well-intentioned city level politicians um, who see jails as maybe an imperfect but somewhat reliable avenue for extending these things to the most sort of marginalized constituents or members of their community. And we do in fact see this all over, from Atlanta to Sacramento to New Orleans to sort of small cities and rural communities. Um, in places like Eastern Kentucky, you encounter less of carceral humanism expressed in the idiom that we've come to expect it, like as a kind of channeling of this sort of shallow, in my opinion, social justice oriented politics into the jail. You don't really see it that much like that. But having said that, and again with some speculation here, I do wonder about, this is where my head is right now. I wonder about the role of rural healthcare generally, and more specifically around addiction and treatment, such that for those of us who are critics of mass incarceration, it can simultaneously do two things. It simultaneously often, in my experience, stands in for how we sometimes talk about shifting carceral capacities, i.e., we say things like very, very important things, right? Like people in jail who have mental health concerns or addiction or whatever deserve care, not cages, right? So we invoke the importance of a treatment ecosystem, right? So it can simultaneously be that and at the same time be concretely and ideologically sort of woven into carceral capacities in all kinds of places. And I think that is, in fact, what's happening in Eastern Kentucky. There are jails that, like I said before, every jail there is somewhere between 100 and 220% capacity. And those jails exist alongside and next to and actually expanding what I've heard people call treatment industrial complex, which I'm not convinced is actually something different entirely from what we might call the prison industrial complex. So again, this is not the exact same thing as carceral humanism, but it does seem to be an emerging component of the carceral geography of the region that seems to be driven less by the kinds of harsh sentencing laws that I was talking about before, and more kind of like emerging consensus about addiction treatment, but in a context where the options for treatment are themselves very connected to incarceration. And then, very briefly, the other reading I think that we can take of carceral humanism that's less charitable is that in its attempts to kind of manage the crises of racial capitalism and maybe the crack legitimacy of the carceral state, including the threats posed to it by the uprisings of 2020 and beyond, I think we could think about it as a kind of neutralizing and even counterinsurgent force that's expressed through a kind of class alliance across state, nonprofit, and even corporate actors whose work to like reimagine incarceration, as they often call it, through justice campuses and what sometimes get called like feminist jails and things like that, might make modest improvements to incarceration or not, while underwriting its overall credibility. And in doing so, then attempting to kind of quell abolitionist demands. And just real briefly, um, the best book, full stop, that I've read over the last year, which also historicizes this, is Orsanmi Burton's Tip of the Spear, which talks about what he calls the Long Attica Revolt. And in that book, he gives us this incredible, what we could think of as like a genealogy of modern day carceral humanism, where he documents how New York State, on the heels of Attica, so they just, killed 39 people, right? 11 guards and 28 prisoners, something like that. And on the heels of that, New York State took this other approach toward trying to quell this revolutionary spirit inside New York State prisons, which is that they deployed a kind of humane reform, right? They developed education and treatment programs and additional space and all this kind of stuff very explicitly as tools of counterinsurgency to try and ideologically capture like revolutionary and radical political activity and sort of neutralize it through sort of extending liberal benevolence. So I think we have to sort of hold all of that at once. So that's the sort of second point that I wanted to be sure to make. And just to begin to wrap up here with this third point, which is really also sort of like just a general argument, which is that to me, one of the ways to think about this is that incarceration is really an expression of class war. This is maybe sort of obvious, to a lot of people when you see someone getting killed in the street by police. But I think that sort of spectacular expression of war can mystify or mask its more quotidian, daily, but no less violent expressions. That also can then open up lots of opportunities for our own analysis and intervention. So when a county builds a new jail or expands an existing jail, they're using public money to fund cages as a way to, manage these numerous crises that we've been talking about, which could be revenue or job loss, or could be addiction or overcrowding or whatever. But this is a choice to build out state capacity and infrastructure at the local level in its most pointedly violent form, even if cloaked in these other kinds of logics or idioms like carceral humanism. And of course, that state capacity could be built out in any number of other ways: universities, parks, houses, etc. And I want to just be sure to end by talking about some of the ways that people are in fact intervening in that. So the carceral realignment that I think is underway in Eastern Kentucky is of course not inevitable. And what's happening right now is this continuation of a rich and multi-sided and multiracial history of solidarity work against the prison industrial complex. So in the fights against the prison in Letcher County, you have lots of local landowners who don't want to sell their land for all kinds of reasons, who have become more sort of politicized through organizing. You have a community radio show that's part of a stalwart media arts organization in Eastern Kentucky called Appalachia that broadcasts messages of love and support into the prisons and into the 8 prisons that are in its listening range from family members on the outside. And people affiliated with that show have been deeply politicized by the show and by their sort of proximity to the horrors of mass incarceration and have become central protagonists in these 2 iterations of struggle against two iterations of a campaign against the prison in Letcher County. And maybe one final point to end on here that I think is important for us to think about. Even as it's clear that this struggle is sort of iterative in the sense that the Bureau of Prisons is back trying to resume its campaign to build a prison. It's also clear that the work of the coalition has actually shifted the terrain of struggle. And there's a number of differences this time around that I think require an adjusted analysis in order to think about how carceral actors and capacities react and shift in response to opposition and what that reveals about opportunities for leverage. So during that first fight, I talk about this in the book, there was this sort of coherent power block between the Obama administration, DOJ, the Bureau of Prisons, Congress, and local political leaders who all sort of coalesced over time to support the prison. That's not the case now anymore. And and now, even as the prison is sort of moving forward, that block has been sort of fractured, and there's lots of internal contradictions. So every single budget proposal since 2017 or 2018 maybe, from both the Trump administration and the Biden administration has called for the rescinding of those funds, have basically said, we don't want this prison for all kinds of reasons that we can get into if people are interested. There have been these interesting telling moments of political theater where you had like far-right Republicans arguing with far-right Republicans about the prison. You had the Deputy Attorney General under Donald Trump, Rod Rosenstein, publicly feuding with Hal Rogers, saying the prison wasn't needed. Um, and there's other examples we could point to. And I think what that sort of amounts to now is you have this bizarre moment where you have the Bureau of Prisons on record for the last 8 years simultaneously saying the prison is unneeded and they don't in fact want it on the one hand, and on the other hand continuing to sort of push it locally in the county towards construction. So I think some of that contradiction, some of those tensions I think we have to credit to sort of the work of the coalition that forced the Bureau of Prisons' hand to have to admit all kinds of things about all kinds of fallacies in its own logic and plans about the prison. And I think that's important for us, right? To sort of think about ways to sort of exploit those. And so now where we're at, and I'm happy to sort of take questions about this or talk through it more, is like this new iteration of the coalition is formed. It's building on the foundations of the first coalition, and the stakes, I think, are laid all the more bare by the floods of 2022 and the response to those floods by the federal government that seems to propose a prison as a putative solution. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there so that we've got at least 25 minutes or so we can chat. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I was really captivated by the way that you've brought in the notion of carceral humanism. So in my own my dissertation work is looking at the profusion of like technology into like local jails, kind of writ large, but like primarily in Virginia. and this idea that like every prisoner's got a tablet now, right? And so they can
Yes,
access educational programs and stuff. And so there's an element of this. And I've read a little bit of Kilgore's stuff. So it was cool to see how you're kind of connecting that with the drug crisis, right? So the opioid epidemic, right, which you talk about in the book, kind of overlays or some of these other moments of crises, right? So the expansion of carceral state and the collapse of the coal economy, and
totally.
anecdotally, I've heard people say, personally say stuff like, "Oh well, yeah, I'm going to jail for a little bit, but at least I'll get clean for a minute," because it's the one place where they can kind of have some respite from their addiction. Um,
Totally.
would you mind dropping the author's name for the Tip of the Spear book? Because I definitely want to check that out, and other people might be interested in that as well. And then I had a question, and then we can open it up to other people's questions as well. I'm sure there's a lot of good stuff going around the room. I had a question about your methodology, and particularly like the use of conjunctural analysis as informed by Stuart Hall. And so I was really curious if you wanted to perhaps briefly discuss like how or elaborate on how that informed your elaboration of these crises, and maybe even like the way that I really like how you incorporate like testimony and like empirical kind of local level stuff into your overarching arguments, for
Yeah.
example.
Thank you for that. So, just before I forget, this is the book. I keep it handy at all times. Tip of the Spear. Orisanmi Burton is the author's name. Ori is a anthropologist. He's trained as an anthropologist and trained as a library scientist. So it's very archival, and he's done like I think he did 60 plus interviews with people formerly um, well, not all are formerly incarcerated necessarily. All are veterans of Black liberation and other kind of radical struggles in the 1960s and 70s. Many of whom, of course, were incarcerated. So it's an I mean, on the subject of methodology, like it's an incredibly rigorous book, and just an incredible read. So highly, highly recommend. Um, yeah, methodology. So I've been a fan of Stuart Hall's for a very long time. I mean, I actually remember reading Stuart Hall in college, which for me was a while ago, to be honest. And his conjunctural analysis that he deploys in Policing the Crisis and has expanded on, it's a treatment and expansion of a concept from Gramsci, where it's essentially like trying to sort of think through what we're encountering in our political work and research and analysis that is what Gramsci calls organic or objective. Like, what are those things that kind of traverse epochs? And what are the things that are what he calls conjunctural, that are expressions of the kind of congealing of multiple contradictions into crisis, right? And so that's kind of part of our work as analysts is to be like, I mean, to be very like explicit about it. Like, let's think about the police, for example, right? Like the police have been the like the police have sort of always been the state's the state's expression of the state's expression of violence, or the attempt to kind of violently address the crises of capitalism in the United States, at least since the 1600s, right? And we can chart that over centuries. So that on the one hand is sort of objective, but of course that looks different in different places in different historical moments. So conjunctural analysis is to really just sort of take seriously that things are different. What's happening in Blacksburg and in Virginia may resemble because of proximity and demographic similarity and whatever may resemble what's happening in Eastern Kentucky. But of course, there's also like different veins of history that are going to structure it differently from what's happening. And which is also to say that even what happens in Letcher County, Kentucky, might look differently from what's happening in a county that's just adjacent to it. And conjunctural analysis is a way to sort of really pay attention to economy, ideology, politics, et cetera, that are producing similar and different kinds of expressions and outcomes. And I came to that for two ways. And I think, Shane, you were sort of getting at this. One was, of course, through coming into the work, having an approach in mind that I get from people like Stuart Hall and Ruthie Gilmore and other folks. And the other, quite frankly, is the sort of empirical nature of the work. So I come in, as somebody trained for better or for worse in kind of criminology and who is sort of trained to think about mass incarceration through an analysis of punishment and punitive legislation and what sociologists call the punitive turn. But who increasingly, largely because of just the stuff that I'm studying, is like, that explains some of it, but doesn't explain a lot. And so I've had to sort of turn to geographers and other folks to try and explain it. But it was in fact the empirical nature of what's happening that sort of pushed me to do that. So I say this, I think in the beginning of the book, like I would go to Eastern Kentucky in the early stages of the research and be like, what's happened? Like, why are there so many prisons here? Like, tell me what's happening. And people would be like, well, to understand it, you actually need to maybe think less about mass incarceration and more about the fact that there's a trash incinerator over there and a coal slurry pond a mile up the road here, and this is an MTR site, and there's a landfill down the road. Like people were like literally saying this is a waste geography, whether we're talking about coal waste or human produced waste or humans as waste, the people who are produced into the racialized surplus population under capitalism. So that to me is a conjunctural analysis. That's saying, like, look at what's happening here in the landscape, look at the sort of factors that are coming together to produce this geography. And of course, there were analysts that helped me think through it, analysts meaning scholarly analysts, but it was also the analysts on the ground who were living it, who were the first people to be like, this is how you should think about your questions, and you should maybe ask different questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, if you might have read it, I just recently got the chance to read Tony Jefferson's work on Stuart Hall and conjuncture, and so yeah, that that reflection of like the empirical kind of always informing on our theories, so that we're not just kind of yeah running blind or whatever. Does anybody else want to have a question that they want to
I'll jump in with a political question because, of course, this is the great week to talk politics in our world at this point. But um, we've just seen an election, which in some ways we'll be digesting for a long time, but at least in part, we've seen that cities are facing struggles because of political understandings of what's happening in them regarding disorder or however you want to view what's happening, and then it's been viewed as disorder or whatever, where the answer to that seemingly is in harsher punishments and other places. So there seems to be nationally a moment of potential backlash against this, some of the kind of work that's happening in Letcher and otherwise. I'm wondering if you could comment on, like having been to school in Kentucky, the difference between Lexington and Louisville and Eastern Kentucky, and like the differences between even Lexington and Louisville and these places, but in terms of how that informs what's happening in Eastern Kentucky, how this broader understanding of disorder and or whatever we want to call it, I'm not sold on that terminology, but and how it informs this broader conversation about mass incarceration or the way that prisons infect the populations that they're serving.
Mm, it's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, I obviously am also just like trying to make sense of what's happened, and like probably everybody is simultaneously like reading a lot and listening a lot and also feeling oversaturated at times. I also have two kids who are tween. I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, and trying to help them make sense of it and whatever. It's all like outrageous and difficult and very, very difficult to sort of think through. I will say a couple things that just sort of come to mind, and curious to hear your thoughts. Happy to answer follow up, whatever. On the one hand, we certainly haven't like defeated or even really maybe even made a dent in the kind of carceral common sense that responds to um, social disorder, objective social disorder, or manufactured social disorder with cops in cages, right? Like that is still sort of the dominant way that people imagine a response to perceived social order, whether we're talking about um, quote unquote riots and uprisings or an immigration crisis or whatever. The kind of common sense answer is always, or not. I mean, this is one of those things that's conjunctural, right? Has been for the last 50 years or so. More cops on the street, more jail cells, more prisons, more training facilities, right? I mean, that's what's happening like in Atlanta with Cop City and other proposed cop cities. So on the one hand, I think people will still respond to that, right? And that sort of response will resonate because that has been our idea of order and disorder, I think, has been largely captured by the carceral state. On the other hand, or at the same time, um, I guess two things, if you take Eastern Kentucky as a place from which to think about this. One is that many, many people in Eastern Kentucky themselves have been touched by the carceral state, right? They themselves have been incarcerated or on probation, or they have loved ones who are experiencing addiction or who have done time or who work in a prison or whatever. And so they know very intimately that these are um, horrifying places to be incarcerated and frankly, like pretty terrible places to work as well, right? People probably know this, but it's maybe worth saying like people who work in prisons have higher rates of intimate partner violence, higher rates of addiction, higher rates of alcoholism, higher rates of physical and mental health problems. So there's part of me that's like, you know, even as there is still this kind of accepted common sense we have to work against, I'm actually not convinced that that accepted common sense is like, or let me say it another way. I'm not convinced that uh, ideology around the carceral state has, to use another phrase from Stuart Hall, hegemonized common sense. Like people have very like complicated and contradictory feelings about it, such that they might support a prison because it's the only thing that's seemingly offering a solution or a futurity, and at the same time, they might have a very visceral negative response to the police because the police have brutalized their family over time in the coal fields, right? So people hold these kinds of contradictions. I guess the other thing I would say here is like, I do think come to people are changed by engaging in political work. I mean, I think all of us are. I think maybe particularly, at least just speaking personally, what I've seen in the Letcher fight, it's like people join that fight. People in Letcher County join that fight, if not quite for NIMBY reasons, for reasons that are maybe like NIMBY adjacent. Like, like they don't they don't want a prison in their county. They know that they need other forms of infrastructure, or they don't think it'll provide that many jobs, whatever. And so they join the coalition. And through the work of the coalition, they're actually like, oh, hold up a sec. Like, it's not just that we don't want a prison in Letcher County. Like, we shouldn't have a prison in any county. Like, this is a bad idea for all kinds of people. So that's the other thing I would say is like people change, and they change through their proximity to and participation in campaign work and struggle, and that's another thing. I know your question wasn't like what's giving me hope or anything like that, but that's kind of what I'm coming to is like I've seen people be changed by this work, and it's the kind of stuff that kind of touches everybody.
I'll take hope wherever I can get it at the
Yeah,
moment.
right.
So I will just ask real briefly, maybe if you can give the 30-second or the 1-minute overview. We have a number of international students as a member of this group.
Awesome.
Could you perhaps give an overall understanding real briefly of the prison abolition movement in the US and what that is and what it means essentially?
Hell yeah. Love that question. Always. Yeah, I mean, as long as there have been prisons, there have been people who are like, this is a terrible idea to put people in cages. And so there's, in fact, some of the earliest abolitionists were the very people who started prisons, and that's the Quakers. The movement around the abolition of the prison industrial complex really started in the 1970s. And was kind of a part of and adjacent to the Black freedom struggle and became a lot more sort of prominent in the 90s and early 2000s through lots of movement infrastructure like organizations and intellectual production and political work. And it looks like a lot of things in practice. It looks like opposing prison and jail construction. It looks like shutting down supermax units, which are like, you know, play like units within prisons where people spend 23 or 24 hours a day inside. It looks like building out alternatives to calling the police. So the abolition movement is, some of the more kind of like pithy bumper sticker expressions of it are like burn the prisons down. But actually in practice, it's a lot of people working for, let's call it what it is, like reforms, changes that shrink the prison system and shrink it significantly, if incrementally, while building out the kinds of capacities that actually provide safety and support and meaning and whatever to people's lives.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I think at one point you mentioned in this chapter 6, I think that we read that 6% of folks in Martin County, which had a prison that you cited, a federal prison, had a baccalaureate degree. And I think at another point you indicated that often DOJ will require a baccalaureate. Do you have updated data across the prisons you've been studying about, you might call it the localization of employment? I mean, what has been the percentage when the promises have been made? This will replace full employment. You won't be suffering in the way you are with these higher employment rates. Even assuming it's the only game in town, how much of it actually is employing folks who were otherwise unemployed following the decline in mining?
This is where scale matters a lot. So in the counties with federal prisons, it remains like that because the feds have much higher standards when it comes to eligibility. Bachelor's degree, clean credit check, clean criminal background check, clean credit check. You have to be under 37. I'm missing something there, but their criteria for employment by the federal government that, like you just said in the question, the vast majority of people can't meet in counties with federal prisons. Where this gets more complicated is that state prisons have lower criteria. And so the state of Kentucky can more credibly make the argument. So I'll give you a very concrete example. There are two. The State Department of Corrections there's a whole chapter in the book that's dedicated to this private prison in Eastern Kentucky in Floyd County that closed in 2012. Well, the state reopened it as a state prison that the state is now leasing from CoreCivic, from this private prison company. So the state reopened it and now holds 700 state prisoners. I don't actually know this, but my guess is they were able to rehire many of the relatively local people who were employed by the private prison now as state employees. If not directly in that very tiny county or tiny community called Wheelwright, in probably from some of the surrounding communities, and certainly within that county. In a county slightly north of that, still very much in the coal fields, the state is doubling the capacity of its existing state prison there. It's a prison called, not to be confused with USP Big Sandy in Martin County. It's a state prison called Little Sandy. It was built with a capacity of like 800 or 900 people. They're literally adding on 800 or 900 beds, doubling its capacity. and can fairly credibly say they're going to add about 150 jobs from mostly local people. And that's a tougher argument to um, criticize because their cri employment criteria are lower. And so more local people will get those jobs. Now, whether you can make the argument that, whether you can jump from that empirical fact to an argument that that in fact will bring the kind of pie in the sky rural economic development that these people propose, I think is a different question. But it is true that they will be able to provide more jobs.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was interested earlier how you related that to Siegel's idea of violence work, and like just again anecdotally, but I recently moved out, so I'm living in Narrows, so like out of town, like so in the country technically, but ish, out here. And I was struck. My partner, has kids, and we went to. They had like a school job fair thing, and there were three entities there promoting jobs for high school students, and it was um, uh, COs, police, and military recruiters, and that's it. Like that, and so it's just really sad. Like, I mean, like, the way that I think that there is this sort of ideological component of the reproduction of some of these things. Even just right here, like, yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's some of the hardest stuff to write through and think about because it's just what you said. I mean, it's like very depressing in a way. Um, it does also, for me, also raise areas ripe for intervention, right? I mean, what is that if not state capacity? In another era, in a different conjuncture, we're talking about instead of whatever, like the state DOJ and local police and the military, we're talking about, I don't know, like the county school district and the rural hospital and I don't know, the YMCA or something like that, right? Like this could be very different. It does not have to be those three entities, which of course it's the same shit here. um, and it just seems to me to be it's yeah, I don't know. It's just like another place for us to think about the importance of this kind of work, right?
Well, maybe I'll ask one final question here, which is you've got this edited book with activists. Can you talk a little bit about the scholarship of working with activists, writing with activists, and
Mm.
kind of living in that space in some ways?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that question. This is the book, by the way. I keep it also at the ready. It's called The Jail is Everywhere, Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration. Came out earlier this year with Verso. Yeah. I mean, so Jack Norton, Lydia Palo Hobbs, and I have known each other for a long time. All of us have been involved in jail campaign, anti-jail expansion campaigns. All of us have written about it. And at some point a couple years ago, we were like, just sort of realizing that like upstate New York, where Jack has done a lot of work, and rural Pennsylvania, where he's done a lot of work, and Atlanta, New Orleans, where Lydia's done a lot of work, and Kentucky and Indiana, where I've done a lot of work, and other places that all of us had been in touch with, were like all experiencing jail fights. And we were like, well, you know, to go back to just a minute, my response to that question, to the question about abolition, the abolition movement for a very, very long time was really focused on prisons specifically, which made a lot of sense for the first few decades. Well, let's call it for the 1990s and 2000s. And there's just been like a lot less attention on jails. Jails feel a lot less sexy in a way, and traditionally don't cost as much money, and bring in are just like not as sort of spectacular when it comes to campaign work. But we realized that there was a lot of actually like seemingly provincial fights happening around the country that were in fact connected in all kinds of concrete ways. And it just made sense to like kind of reach out to our networks and be like, what are people doing? Are people interested in writing about this? And so the book came together just sort of organically through us reaching out to organizers we know to be like, hey, take a few thousand words and sort of tell us what's happening and give us some analysis. So there's 11 chapters written by 11 different folks, all of whom are involved in jail work and who are kind of analyzing doing conjunctural analysis, basically, of their own counties. And so you've got some big cities represented. There's a chapter on New York and a chapter on Atlanta, chapter on New Orleans. You have smaller cities represented like Sacramento, Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. And then there's a couple chapters on rural counties, like in upstate New York and a rural county in Southern Oregon. And that was kind of our goal for the book, was to try and get at that kind of expansive geography of where you're finding this stuff now. But it was a really cool process, actually, to work with those folks.
Very good. Well, I suppose we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Schept.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. Really lovely to chat with you all. And if people have follow-up stuff they want to talk about or have questions or whatever, please feel free to just email me and reach out.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.